Well, okay, here we go. We're going to do a little quick discussion about the third project here. I'm going to pull up some PowerPoint images, just again to kind of expand some ideas of inspiration, Inspirato. Um, you know, talk about how some of these things are made, so we can start thinking about the process and ways we can break down some ideas. So first, let's take a look over here. And so real briefly, this is our project that we're going to be looking at. This, of course, is up on Blackboard. This is project 2. I'm going to change that. It should say project 3. So basically, we're going to be using wheel thrown. And if you want to include some hand-built objects into this, you can. But we're basically trying to use wheel throwing to create larger objects. So what does that mean? So we're going to try and create something that's 16 inches tall, minimum, and then 6 inches wide is a minimum, but at its widest point. So you can have parts that are more narrow than that. You just need at least 6 inches wide at its widest point. So we're going to be, what we make, it can be functional, it can be sculptural. That interpretation, again, is up to you. But we want to think about we want to use a minimum of 4 objects to create each of our singular objects, whether it be vessels. I'll probably just say vessels a lot just because it's a little bit easier. So essentially we want to make 1 vessel out of 4 objects, or 4 wheel thrown segments. And then we're going to make a total of 2 of these 16-inch tall vessels or objects, what have you. So in theory, it could be at least 8 objects to make this up. I want to use more than that, great. That's kind of how you determine to do this. In theory, you could make 4 4-inch tall objects to make 16 inches happen. Some of this is going to depend a little bit on what you decide to make, but as normal, we want to think about clean bottoms that are smooth, won't scratch something later on. Rims should also be, if you're making kind of a standard vessel, it should be, smooth, potentially even, cohesive to the rest of the piece is basically what we're looking for. Again, as we're thinking about these, they're one object, so there should be consensus, continuity from top to bottom, not just kind of slapping things together. But like I said, in the end, we're making 2 of these 16-inch tall objects. They don't have to relate to each other. You can think of it as a diptych, or you could just make 2 totally different things, different styles. This is your time to experiment. We're going to end up wood firing these objects. We'll talk more about that in an upcoming video, but first I want to kind of get the gears rolling of what to make. Obviously, as usual, we're going to have to upload some sketches and reference material to Blackboard. It's due Monday, September 28th at the beginning of class. So let's stop sharing. Let's start a new share. Let's come over here to powerpoint.com. And let's see if I can make this a full screen. All right. So this is just going to be a series of objects that are made out of multiple wheel thrown components. Some I know they are, some I'm guessing they are, or I'm going to at least talk about ways that they can be broken down. So this is Betty Woodman. If you were in my beginning class, you're probably familiar with her work. I've seen it before. Let's see. Can I bring... Okay. So hopefully this mouse shows up. What is that? Dun, 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 dun. Ooh, laser pointer. Hello. Okay. So this is Betty Woodman's work. She was a very talented, very prolific ceramic artist. Did a lot kind of during the abstract expressionist era to transfer that idea, that mentality, that concept onto pottery. So what we have these objects, these picture forms, if you can't see by looking at it, it's, the body of this is made up of 2 wheel thrown pieces on their sides. You can see the throwing lines going vertical rather than horizontal. Basically, there are 2 domes made, 2 tall domes, and then the end just kind of really interestingly pinched off at the top. but they're just sandwiched together in the middle with another ring, it looks like, and then put on their side. And then coming out of the side of it, which is, well, now the top of it, is another cylinder to create these spout sections for, or neck sections for the spouts to come off. So it's you've got two objects on the base, one on the neck, maybe two for this one, probably just one. And then using wheel cut elements to create this spout that looks like. And then even this handle could have potentially been wheel thrown the way that it looks with these ridges. Could have been a wheel thrown object, might have been extruded. And this one kind of more of a traditional slab. So these pieces can get pretty big. A lot of times ones of these I've seen, from side to side, they could be about 18 inches, sometimes almost 2 feet. And sometimes a little bit smaller too. It's kind of a nice range of study. But I think they're a nice example to show, because not only are we stacking objects to create size, to create scale, but we're also kind of turning these things on their side, turning these objects on their side, and thinking about it allows us to think about wheel thrown objects in a different orientation than they come off the wheel. This is Beatrice Wood. Again, more just this image on the right isn't very good, I'm sorry, but it's a good example for work. We just see a lot of smaller objects being put together. For something like this, these are like goblet size. So the one on the right's kind of a goblet, the one on the left's kind of a vase. It's probably, let's say it's even like 12 inches tall. It would be really hard to throw this in one piece on the wheel and not have this bottom section be too heavy. So by creating all these, let's just guess that looks like these two objects could have been one, but this was probably one shape on its own. And then this flared out rim was one on its own. So again, we get a little bit more complicated of a form because we're not trying to make it all at once. It's just Toshiko Takezu. We can't really see a scale of these necessarily right now in this image, but basically, I could stand next to this piece and it would probably be about the same size as me, maybe a little smaller, maybe a little bit taller. They tend to vary a little bit by size, but they're usually, about 1.5 to 2 feet wide. These are very large objects, and essentially, they're all wheel thrown, but they were kind of wheel thrown in segments. So typically, she would throw the bottom, as tall as she could, and then let it dry, and then put on another section and throw that up taller, and then kind of continue that until she got the height that she wanted. This is Sam Chung. These are all wheel thrown objects or wheel thrown component based objects. These are all made out of porcelain, which if you probably haven't used porcelain, but if you haven't heard someone discussing porcelain, it's got much more of a consistency of cream cheese than clay. So it can be really challenging to build with, throw with. It doesn't have a lot of structural integrity to it. It tends to slump a lot if it's overworked. And so what we see with these objects is, these would definitely be really challenging to make in one form, depending on especially the scale of these. You can almost see a division happening in some of these pieces right here would be the easiest way to make these. Again, it's like, someone could throw this all in one piece, but the bottom might be really heavy and a lot of trimming would be needed. So it might be more efficient to throw this in 2 or 3 pieces, depending on the scale, so that, all these pieces could be thrown efficiently and you could throw them to the appearance that they want or that you want without having to trim them later on. And this vase on the left, we really see this kind of harsh, almost slab-like alteration happening to things. I think some slabs are also included in this process. Again, just more ways to think about breaking up the form. Oh, and jump back to some Takeju pieces. Again, a large scale. This is Kirk Mangus. This piece on the right, I'm not entirely convinced that, aside from the handle, it's not all made one piece, but I think it could, play into a way of thinking about, breaking it up into these different levels. Could be potentially difficult to throw this as a larger piece all in one shot because this bottom might have to be so thick to support all this weight going in that it might be easier just to throw maybe two of these steps per ring and then put them together later. And same for this vessel on the left. This bottom would have to be almost solid to try and support this weight on the wheel, because of where it flares out and then it's got more weight on top. It would be really much easier to break this up into three, say throw this foot piece, then throw the body, and then leave this neck section up to the rim all in one piece. Would be a lot more of an efficient way to try and build this. This is John Ballesteri. Somebody has told me, and I could have misinterpreted or misremembering, but I'm almost 100% sure that these aircraft planes, and again, the wingspan on these are about like, life size to like a person spreading their wings. Maybe not that big, but they're probably three, maybe 4 feet wide, some of them. But they're all made out of wheel throwing components. And so, they definitely don't look like they're vessel oriented in their shape, but you can really see where they've been altered down, and they're very, very slim. But you can just really start to understand, hopefully, or start to see possibilities of what throwing can be as an object versus just vessels. So the body of this plane is very cylinder-esque. It's probably made up in multiple sections, and then the wings are essentially just oval forms, and then probably cut up and dismantled and put together again. So it's a nice example for that. This is Kirk Mangus. I'm not sure why I say Kirk Mangus here. This is actually Ken Ferguson, like again, the slide says. This is a taller jawler. He might have thrown it in one piece. It looks like this kind of belt section was probably where another piece was added. So we can think about, really highlighting what's happening. This previous piece of John's, excuse me, there's no segments happening here. You can't tell where any attachments are, except for maybe some of what's happening with these wings. But with this piece of Kurt's, it's very dramatic where this section is happening. Whereas on this piece of his on the right, it was made out of multiple pieces, but everything's been really smoothed down so much. So we see a really nice contrast just in this one artist. This is more work of Betty Woodman's. She was that first image that we saw. This is some of her more larger sculptural vessels. Kind of what we have happening here is, looking at this piece in the middle, there's a seam right here, probably a seam right here, and even right here looks like it could have a seam or maybe just a mark on it. Similar to this one on the right, we see a seam here, see a seam here. She's basically just making these large cylinders and then creating these slabs, these big, thick, heavy slabs to come off in the surface. And really kind of created these panels almost for like, treating them like canvases, making this really nice self-reference to the objects that are on them, with these shapes almost like shadows being cast. Another one of those, but with floor piece to go along with it. It's a really interesting interpretation of a way to create volume in a vessel. It's almost like this could be a handle and this is like a spout coming off, but it's not. But even this has like a little bit of a handle cut out. Those pieces by Matt Sheeman. He tends to, these are larger pieces again. This one on the right is probably closer to 2 or 3 feet tall. Just throwing these in sections, he cleans them up pretty well to where you can't really see sectioning happening. But especially with this next section here, it'd be really challenging, not only for scale, but just the general proportions of what's happening here. To make this thrown really nice and light and even, and then try and have this big neck all in one piece would be really challenging. So we want to think about that. Some of these pieces we've seen so far have been really segmented in where attachments are happening, but this one's, we don't see that as much. And so we can kind of think about just creating clean forms or smooth transition forms out of these multiple objects. More work by Ken Ferguson. We have a really deliberate definition of different pieces here with the legs on this kind of tureen type jar. And we haven't talked about lids yet. We'll talk about them in the next project. But again, so now we're just, again, it's like, here it's very hidden in the way it's put together, that these are, some objects are being stacked on top of each other. But with this one on the left and even on the right, it's very deliberate, showcasing that almost. This is Andrea Gill, again, kind of almost like those pieces by Betty Woodman, creating kind of a traditional vessel shape here. There's kind of this long neck happening here down the center, and this almost like shouldered gourd-like section for the bottom, but then more slabs coming off. Again, it's become like a canvas, she's painting on, decoration pattern. This always reminds me of a turnip or maybe a beet based on the color, but who knows? And then over here we can kind of see a face being made. It looks like these are more than slabs, almost like pointed cones coming off like hair. Could be really kind of interesting. This is Don Wright pieces. So again, in this jar on the left, typically these were very large, close to 2 or 3 feet tall, and maybe 2 foot wide or so. And so this would be a really challenging piece to throw in one piece, just because to have this small of a bottom and then this much width coming out and then going back in and then going back on top with more height would want to just make this shoulder collapse, which would make this bowl section want to collapse. So it'd be much easier to throw this big bowl and then this ring section and then another ring for the neck. And then even possibly a 4th section that would help deal with this lid section on the top. And then this piece on the right isn't a really great image, but again, it's just from his ring toss series of just stacking cylinders and using that as a way to create shape and volume. More of those ring toss series, kind of on a smaller scale. But again, all of a sudden, these are just thrown cylinder rings that are being cut up and used to kind of build these, playful interactions. Again, very different from what we typically think of when we think of wheel-thrown things. This is work by Peter Biesecker. Not 100% sure how these are made. I mean, obviously there are 2 pieces put together. Porcelain. I'm assuming that, this is one big piece, and then this is the second piece. Could be that these were on this horizon line. Horizon line? No. This line across the midsection. You could do that in 2 sections, if your throwing isn't very comfortable yet to make larger things. Basically making 2 bowls or 2 domes to kind of stack that shape up. Work by Kathy King. Wow, the image on the right is rough. I apologize. Again, we just see this piece on the left, more imagery. But again, just these really kind of deliberate little pots being made, or what I'm going to call little pots, because it's what they remind me of, to stack up this shape, and then these really interesting things coming out of the side. And then bird stacking on top. It's really kind of interesting. It's almost like a tree-like structure. This is work by Chandra Debuse. A lot of this is hand-built, but again, just like it, because it's a good example of how we can break up space and break up height and create more interesting forms. I don't know why. Oh, this is going on to a different thing. So I'm going to stop this here. All right, so after this, you can start watching some demo videos and come up with ideas of your own. Let me know if you have any questions.